Did you know that the average adult's attention span is lower than that of a goldfish? In the year 2000, average adults had attention spans of only 12 seconds, but over time that has now dwindled to a mere 8 seconds. In a world with bright, flashing lights and fast-paced action, this can make diving into a book very difficult for expanding advanced societies. With the many technological advancements in modern society, Troy's historical public libraries have been struggling to maintain themselves as a threshold for books and the capacity for knowledge. Troy's public libraries have always been a staple for the city of Troy, but have grown to lack funding and the improper audiences have reduced their capacity. Out of their few remaining locations, only one is still consistently running, but that has not always been the case. Following the American Civil War and reconstruction of many major cities came new and renovated establishments. The first time the Troy Public Library was mentioned in historical archives is around 1799 when construction was starting. Essentially, several of Troy's leading citizens bounded together to form the Troy Public Library by subscription, but the current location was completed in 1897 towards the end of the Gilded Age. Especially in times where technology, as we now know it, was relatively primitive, the use of libraries and their ever-expanding audiences were endless. At the time, books and libraries were the primary source for knowledge expansion and thus were deemed essential by the general public. Troy tried to keep up with neighboring developing cities, and establishing a library for the general public would be a great way to do that. The building itself, the main branch, is one of the oldest cultural institutions in the city of Troy. It was originally designed by Barney and Chapman, who were actually architects of several New York churches. This is quite prominent when looking at the aesthetics of the Hart Memorial Library, which was derived from Italian models and was donated by Mary Eade Hart in honor of her husband, William Howard Hart. As far as the branch of the Troy Public Library is concerned, it is most notable for interior decor, consisting of marble structures, wood carvings, an ornamental plaster ceiling, and the fact that even with time, the interior and exterior structures have remained intact. Widely known as a work of art, it is an early example of the combination of art and architecture. In the 1960s, one of the architects for this branch stated that if it were in New York City, it would be a constant objective point for sightseers all over the country. This statement tells us that even in its earlier development, location and the capacity for public interest and influx would be severely limited and below its potential. If we were to consider the previous history of Troy and Cohoes around this period, we can see the fall of Harmony Mills and Troy's ironworks, thus reducing the local areas to an industrial wasteland, so lightly stated by Daniel Walkowitz in his book Worker City Company Town. Even at its highest point, the library has limits on capacity for audiences, as many locals were Irish and French Canadian immigrants who worked long 8 to 12-hour days, including their children when they were not in school. This could potentially help explain future regressions in the industry with the expansion of modern technologies. Initially, it took upwards of 96 years for Troy's public libraries to find a home. For many years since its conception in 1799, the library actually ended up moving from homes and offices of those that were designated librarians. This was a temporary system put into place to ensure that there was a library for the people of Troy without yet allocating the budget for the actual ground for it. In 1820, it was designated at the Riverside Drugstore, where there was a fire and 687 volumes were destroyed. Although this was a devastating loss, the majority of the volumes were to be used in Troy's public library were preserved. With the growing popularity and interest in it, Troy's public library was set into motion by the Young Men's Association, and the Lansingburgh branch opened soon after. With a growing audience and student body, the Lansingburgh branch was initiated on 4th Ave on 114th Street. This extension of Troy's public library became very influential in the surrounding areas for the next couple of years. They even contained many advanced study programs for college students at the time. This branch moved a little less fluidly than its main counterpart around 1900. It was leased to Lansingburgh School District No. 1 in order to serve as a high school, and in 1911 a vocational school. These separate moving parts were all disconjoined from the original branch until we reached 1975, where the Lansingburgh Citizens Council decided to reinstate it as the expansion of Troy's public library that it once had been. During the time of the Lansingburgh shift in management, the main branch had their own changes in scenery. In 1846, the library moved to the Athenaeum building. This location was actually used because the Young Men's Association, who was running the library, rented the space from Troy's Savings Bank. Finally, in 1885, the building was officially bought, and this is where the main library stood. at 100 2nd Street. Around 1896 to 97, the Hart Memorial Building was occupied by Troy's public libraries and was marveled at and widely considered a fine example of Italian Renaissance. Although the renovated libraries was still relatively new at this point, they had no shortage of books with over 32,000 and an allocated budget of 12,000. This may seem minuscule in comparison to modern day standards. It is essential to note that $100 in 1900 is worth approximately $3,153 today. Keeping that in mind, it is clear to see that Troy Public Library was initially thriving with this budget in the early 1900s. Troy's Public Library was able to run flawlessly for the next couple of years. In 1905, the library even managed to change their book classifications and circulations in order to meet the state education department requirements for scholars. Just as we see in majority of business structures, with rapid growth must come expanded leadership. Towards 1946, Dr. Ray Palmer Baker actually ended up becoming president of the board of directors of Troy's Public Library annual meeting. He was also coincidentally the dean of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute at the time. At around this point in time, volumes increased from 32,000 to over 75,000. To put that into perspective, modern school libraries usually contain around 8,000 books. Troy's public library branches and systematic profit had only begun to fail quite recently. On top of constant operating costs, there were also costs for maintenance, reconstruction, and renovation that occurred periodically. For example, in the 1970s, they had to do a full restoration of the roof and skylights, which approximated $8,000. Earlier in 1953, Troy's Public Library received upwards of $50,000 per year from the city of Troy. This is almost 5 times what it had just been a century prior. This is most likely because of the post-World War II boom around 1945, where social pressures were now much lower. Rather than military forces and national protection, the main focus of the American people and citizens of Troy was expanding their knowledge in the pre-cell phone age. Continual and periodic grants from the city of Troy still came in around 1959, but as time went on, the people's attention diverted, and with the golden age of televisions, video games were soon invented. Rather than gain knowledge from books, people began to defer to television and expanding media. At this point, television advertisements were already in effect since 1941, but they really began to become popular towards the late 1950s. Starting around the 1970s, operating costs for the library began to increase on a yearly basis. A leaky roof was actually found in 1972, which led to the library representatives allocating more money in order to afford roof restoration and exterior renovation that was previously mentioned. Even the modern-day Troy Public Library website admits that funding was one of the fundamental issues that was consistently prominent within the library. The 1980s brought their own challenges for the Troy Public Libraries. The 1980s also ended up bringing a rise to new technologies. At this point, desktop computers were just being introduced to the public, which was as recent as 1974. They began their increase in processing power and the ability to have a personal computer. Although quite primitive in comparison to today's standards, it still allowed people to have an easy access to the internet. This was a major development for the United States, as it opened a plethora of opportunities for future investments. Also, CDs were invented around 1979. This means that by the 1980s, more and more books were being converted into CDs, which could be listened to on the go. This business model was almost unintentionally destined to put libraries out of business and regress them into obsolete structures. We have seen this occur in modern businesses such as the growth of Netflix and Blockbuster going bankrupt because of similar companies. We're also seeing many large-scale companies and shopping centers get shut down because of the expansion of online shopping. It is very likely that something like this will not only occur to Troy's public library chains, but most libraries as a whole. If the operation costs and costs for repairs are more than the profit most libraries produce, the risk of getting shut down. Throughout history, the word of mouth as well as written text has been the major form of knowledge, so naturally, people would jump at the idea to listen to a book rather than have to read it. This could actually end up increasing time efficiency and multitasking in the long run. At this point, operating costs and funding were set at around $160,000 a year, which was an all-time high for the library. Although funding technically went up, so did the cost of the dollar. So the funding ended up staying relatively the same because of inflation. With the increase in expenses, not too much change in revenue coming into the library, and no additional grants, the massive operating costs were starting to become somewhat of an issue. The library representatives realized that this wouldn't be enough and requested more funding from the city. They requested an additional $40,000 for operating costs of the library, but the grant was never provided. As a result of poor funding, lack of incentive, and the rise of new technologies, Troy's public library was at a very, very large risk of closing at around December 6, 1980. Although the library struggled with early advancements of new technologies, the Troy's public libraries had one major thing going for them. They were widely considered architecture worth saving in Rensselaer County. With hints of Italian craftsmanship, this structure was unlike any other surrounding buildings with the exception of Troy's churches. Their somewhat different design approach acted as a doorway to the past to see something that once was. Even as early as 1969, the Troy Public Library was placed on the National Register for Historic Places with preserved documented paperwork. This was most likely in efforts to preserve the fine craftsmanship of the library and to potentially increase the influx of the people to raise popularity. Moving into the early 2000s, their progression had begun to slow down, but it is worthy to note that they never went out of business. In the modern day, it is still holding its foothold on the attention that it once had. It is a wonder to see this type of industry still survive in the harsh realities of modern times and newer standards. It still has somewhat of an audience and is still running with an allocated budget of over $800,000. This may seem like a lot to marvel at, but as previously stated, this is primarily due to inflation, not necessarily that the value has exponentially increased. If we compare this $800,000 to the initial $12,000, we can see that the initial budget today would equate to about $378,000. So it essentially has only a little more than doubled in the span of almost 200 years. In 2020, the revenue managed to reach an all-time high of $1 million, but the expenses are also at an all-time high equivalent. So at this point, without the help of the city of Troy, they would be making essentially no profit. Something to note here is that in the span of from 2011 to 2021, their expenses have managed to increase by almost 30%. At this point, it's very unclear how long they will be able to maintain themselves on the ever-expanding depths of the library. In a world ruled by digital media and marketing, a supercomputer in everyone's pockets, and an attention span lower than ever before, it's very difficult for modern libraries to run at their expected capacity. There are so many moving parts in the ensemble of the lives of modern society that Troy's public libraries are having to struggle with it. With multiple shutdowns, an industrial wasteland of a location, and the increase of annual expenses, it is only about time since Troy's public libraries loosen their foothold on the city and become reduced to a landmark of the past. It is quite impressive that this ancient hallmark still presents itself today as a used establishment, and with this new era, the Troy Public Library will be forced to evolve. By incorporating these new technologies that were initially taking away their audience and implementing new programs for students that need them, there is still hope for Troy's public libraries. As the president of the American Library Association stated, the library of today is not the library of our childhood, and the library that our children see today is not the library we'll see in 20 years.